The hypocrisy of atheism is when atheists hold a belief of their own, a blind belief, all the while criticizing others for holding beliefs. Now, one example of this is the atheist belief in the concept of good and evil. This is something that humanists particularly believe in. Atheists assume that it's possible to define morality without God, that the actions of humans can be defined as good or bad, as right or wrong. But there's no way to scientifically identify anything as being right or wrong. It's just a belief. For example, humanists assume that murder is wrong. But on what scientific basis? Many racial supremacists argue that certain races are inferior, and that just as murdering cows and chickens is not wrong, so similarly murdering the people of certain races is also not wrong. Now, on the other extreme, you have vegans, for example, who argue that animals are not inferior in their principle of sanctity of life, and they have as much of a right to life as we do. And that just as murdering humans is wrong, so similarly the murdering of animals is wrong. I mean, these people see the murdering of animals as being murder. They see animal life as being sacred, and they consider it to be fundamentally a moral flaw and a wrong thing to do. On the other hand, people who are racial supremacists see murdering of human beings and they experience it as nothing more than killing animals. It doesn't bother them at all. Now, there is no scientific evidence on which we can establish this whole idea of sanctity of life, because this is what the whole debate is about. Now, for the human species, what is the sanctity of life, and to what extent does it extend to the animal kingdom, which is based on science, which is not based on just beliefs that we're making up as we go along. So there's no scientific evidence that can prove or disprove any belief in a particular standard of what murder is and what the sanctity of life is. Now, one way to understand this fallacy is through steps, through stages. At exactly what point does murder become wrong? If a plant does not have the right to life, then what about an insect? An insect is a little bit more complex, but if that's not complex enough, if that's not conscious enough, then what about an animal? If it's okay to murder an animal, then what about prehistoric human beings? What about along the path of our evolution? If we were happen to meet a prehistoric human today who was not fully Homo sapien in the definition of the word, but he was almost there, would it be okay to murder it? Would it be okay to kill it in the same way that it's okay to do experiments on and kill monkeys at times? So what was the point, exact point in our evolution after which we had the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and before which we could ethically be killed? There's no evidence for any such point, and any line that atheists or humanists draw is imaginary. It's just something that's based on their own beliefs. So if we can justify the killing of animals for the greater good of humanity, then we have no scientific basis to object to those who conducted ethnic cleansing for what they regarded and argued was the greater good of humanity, or for the greater good of their race, the greater good of the species. We have no scientific basis to object to those who conducted a Holocaust for the greater good of their race. So just as atheists consider animals and plants expendable for the greater good of our species, there are many supremacists, racial supremacists, who consider certain races as expendable for the greater good of their race or for our species. Also, just as atheists consider mass murders to be atrocities, many vegans consider mass killings of animals to be atrocities as well. Why do they do that? It's just because they extend the concept of sanctity of life to animals. That's the only thing that vegans do. We have a made-up belief, atheists and humanists, that human life is sacred. So they just took that made-up belief that has no scientific basis and extended it to animals, and then they define the killing of animals to be murder and something deeply offensive. Scientifically, there's no evidence for atheists that they can base themselves on when they confine their belief on ethics only to a certain species. Now, scientifically, there's no reason why anything can be considered universally good or bad either. Now, in the broad sense of the word that applies to the whole universe, even perpetrating a nuclear holocaust can't be proven as bad or wrong or immoral, because the universe is far greater than our very confined human experience that's happening on this planet, or even in this particular century. Now take, for example, the meteor that wiped out the dinosaurs. That was bad for the dinosaurs, but it was very good for us. In the same way, a nuclear holocaust would be very bad for us, but it would be good for the species, the possible species that comes after us. That species, when they look back at us, they would actually consider that nuclear holocaust to be the dawn of a new age and a better age, in the same way that we look back at the meteor striking the world and see it as a dawn of a new age from where humanity progressed. Now take, just as an example, the story of Planet of the Apes. Now the apes would consider the nuclear holocaust that wiped out humanity to have been good for them. The same way we consider the meteor that wiped out the dinosaurs to be good for us. What is disastrously bad for one could be very, very good for another. Considering how infinitely large the universe is, it's absurd to think that a concept of right and wrong or good or bad universally exists. It's completely subjective, and there's no evidence on which atheists can define the actions of any individual or any government as being good or bad. Whether it's a nuclear holocaust or an ethnic holocaust, whether it's a destroying of people or destroying of rainforests, there's no scientific way to say that this is something that is universally bad. So the inescapable reality is that any stance on something being right or wrong is simply a belief. The concept of goodness is nothing more than a blind faith that atheists and humanists hold. It has no more scientific reality or value than a person's belief in any other issue. So to believe in goodness is to believe in an arbitrary set of rules that we made up ourselves, for no better reason than to just say that that's the way that it ought to be. So atheists take up the position that they do not believe in anything until it has a scientific basis, and then proceed to go on propounding a whole bunch of their own beliefs that have no scientific basis. We have no logical objection to atheists denying the validity of belief, as long as they're straightforward with themselves and others about it. As long as someone is at least logically consistent, there's a point where we can start. But our objection with atheists is they're criticizing theists for adhering to baseless beliefs, all the while adhering to just as baseless of a set of beliefs of their own. These beliefs in consciousness, of free will, of good and evil, of good and bad. So our objection is with this glaring contradiction. It's with this hypocrisy of atheism.